Welcome to lecture 4, which is on the geometry of aerial photographs in photogrammetry. So, in this lecture we will understand the geometry of this aerial photographs and the various technical terms which we will be subsequently using while carrying out the measurement and while carrying out the mapping from these photographs. So, let us begin the lecture. Acquisition of the aerial photograph is the first thing when we want to deal with the aerial photographs. We need every time new photographs because the information on the ground is changing very fast. So, we need a latest information. So, we have to update the maps with the help of the latest photographs, and if we have photograph of a different season and we want for a different season, sometimes we have to carry out say Rabi mapping and we have the Kharif crop season photographs. So, we require the different seasons photographs. So, sometimes the season may not be correct which we are using to carry out the measurements or the scale of the photography. So, scale is also very important to us whenever we are dealing with the small scale or the large scale photograph, because the amount of information which you are going to see, which you are going to extract, that will change. So, all these parameters are actually responsible. That is why we need every time a new photograph. One set of photograph may not be used for much longer time, primarily because the information is changing very fast. Now, in order to acquire these aerial photographs, we have to plan the flight. So, flight planning is done, and in the flight planning when it is done, we have to check the weather. So, we need clear weather, but sometimes this is beyond our control whenever we are taking the images. Time, yes, we can maintain, preferably is 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. because the illumination is maximum during that time and the shadow effect is minimum, particularly in the hilly area, particularly when there are lot of undulation. So, we prefer the morning time when the pollution is less and when the illumination of the sun is maximum, because we are using mostly the daylight for that. Scale and overlap is also very important before we fly to take the images, at what scale the images are to be taken and what will be the overlap between the images, so that we can see a good 3D model. So, little bit about the flight planning. Whenever we have a project, its execution basically would require some photographs. So, these photographs of the project sites are required, and one has to fly to the area and take the images. And nowadays it is possible with the help of the drone also to take the photographs of the project site, the latest photograph of the project site. Now, why it is required? So that we know the extent and size and shape of the area. This is very important before we take up the project. How much is the extent of my area, what is the size, what is the shape, what are the different terrain features, what is the elevation difference in my area. So, this all actually we will come to know with the help of these photographs. So, in order to take the photographs during the flight planning, what is important is some parameters must be known to us, like a focal length of the camera lens. It is supplied along with the camera which you are going to use. What will be the scale of the photograph which you are procuring, the size of the photograph, the amount of overlap, whether you are taking 60% or more, 60% is the minimum. What will be the relief displacement in the area, looking at the minimum and the maximum elevation, what will be the speed of the aircraft, and so on. So, all these parameters are very important whenever the images are taken, the photographs are taken. We also like to know what is the average elevation above mean sea level of the terrain, because the aircraft has to fly at a certain height. So, we have to avoid those tall structures also, the higher ground also. So, we would like to know the average elevation in the area. Then we calculate how many flights would be required, number of flight lines, their locations on the map, spacing between the flight lines and their orientation, whether it is a north-south orientation or east-west or some other orientation. So, all these parameters are required to be known before actually flying to the ground and taking the images. So, this can be done with the help of some existing topographical maps, or nowadays Google images which are freely available are also used. We should also know how much will be the area at my scale covered by one photograph. How many photographs will be covered in each flight line. So, there could be more than one flight line to cover my area. So, one flight line, how many photographs would be there. Then if I know the number of flight lines, I can calculate the total number of photographs. How many photographs would be required at a particular scale to cover my study area. What will be the speed of the aircraft? If there is any tilt required, or we have to compensate for tilt and the crab tolerance, that weather and meteorological conditions. So, they are all very important once the photographs are taken up from the air. This diagram, it shows that how the flight planning would be done. Actually, this is my flight line 1. So, this the aircraft direction is this one from left to right here, and one can see these big dots. So, these big dots are indicating where the camera has exposed the ground. So, camera is looking downward and it has exposed the ground and taken 5 snaps here, and then the aircraft is taking a turn. So, it is a semicircular kind of a turn here, which is outside the area, outside my study area, and then when it enters into my study area again, it will take 5 images once again to cover in the second flight line. So, I know that there are 3 flight lines now in my area according to this figure, and there are 5 photographs in each flight line. So, I have total 15 photographs which are to be analyzed for mapping purpose. So, the diagram shows then how the aircraft will move along the flight line in a zigzag move. So, each photograph along a flight line will have the overlap with the previous photographs. So, that means the 2 consecutive photographs will have the overlap. So, one can see in the top image here photograph number 1 and photograph number 2, and this is the kind of the overlap between the 2 photographs. So, likewise, the aircraft is moving in the forward direction and the maintaining the overlap. Now, the 2 successive photographs which are taken during the flight line called a stereo pair. That means the photograph number 1 and photograph number 2 will call a stereo pair, photograph number 2 and photograph number 3 will call a stereo pair. And the common region which I showed by the red here mark, this is actually called as a forward overlap or end lap. So, if we look into the plan, this is that area which is shown by the dashed line. So, this is the forward overlap or the end lap, and this is normally expressed as a percentage. So, normally it is 60% or more. So, overlap between the photographs in the adjacent flight lines. So, in this diagram I am showing you flight line 1 and flight line 2. So, this is my flight line 2 and this is my flight line 1. So, between the 2 flight line also there is a overlap, and this is the overlap which has been shown here now. This is called lateral or side overlap. So, there are 2 terms here. One is the forward overlap or end lap, and the second term is the lateral overlap or side lap. So, these overlaps are kept intentionally while covering the whole area so that we can create a mosaic and also we can study the area in 3 dimension. So, now we can see that minimum of 60% forward overlap we are maintaining so that we can see a 3D model of the common area. So, between any two successive photographs we are going to maintain 60% or more, and lateral overlap is 25%, so that we can create a good mosaic at the end using the common features. So, these overlaps are very helpful to create the mosaic as well as to see the 3D model, 3-dimensional study. The common overlap between 3 successive photographs. So, if I take photograph number 1, photograph number 2, photograph number 3, so the common portion between the 3 photographs which is shown here by the blue color, that is the superlapped. So, we call it superlap between 3 successive photographs, the common portion. Now, each flight line is called a flight strip on the ground, and each strip has a number of photographs. So, a strip of photographs will be there in each flight line. The photographs or 2 or more flight lines. So, all the photographs, all together I will call it the block of photographs, the bundle of photographs. And by knowing the number of photographs in each flight line and total number of flight lines to cover the area, I can calculate the total number of photographs which are required. We have to consider the overlap region also when we are computing the total number of photographs, and this is important so that we know how many photographs we have to analyze at the end. In India, vertical aerial photographs basically they are taken by Survey of India and National Remote Sensing Center, Hyderabad. So, we have to make the request to them, they will give from the archive or they can fly freshly for us for that purpose. So, if the area is not restricted, then we can get the photographs from these 2 agencies in India. There are few technical terms which are important for us to understand before we use these photographs to carry out the measurement. The first term is the exposure station. So, exposure station is the location of the aircraft in the space. While we are taking the photographs, the aircraft is at some position on the ground. So, this is the exposure station in the diagram. In fact, the diagram which I am showing you in this slide is a very important diagram, and this kind of a diagram will be used many times now in the entire photogrammetric exercise. So, this diagram shows that this is the exposure station, and ABCD is the area which is covered on the ground by a single photograph, and if we look at the image of that, the image in the camera is made on the top. So, let us go to the second term now here, which is the flying height. So, flying height is the height of the aircraft above a datum. So, datum could be mean sea level, or maybe we can say above the ground, the flying height. So, aircraft is flying at a certain height. During a project, the height is maintained, height is almost constant while it is taking the images of a project area. So, this height is known as the flying height, and it is shown by the capital letter H here. So, above the ground, the height of the aircraft is the flying height. It has a direct relationship now with the scale. So, higher the flying height and smaller is the scale of the photograph. So, we have to determine actually flying height with the scale. We need 10,000 scale photograph or we need 5,000 scale photograph. Accordingly, we can determine what will be the flying height. The next term is the perspective center of the photograph. So, perspective center is the origin or termination of the bundle of perspective light rays from the camera lens. So, this is my camera lens here, and you can see that all the rays are radiating or terminating at this particular point. So, this is called the perspective center, and the projection system where the rays are radially moving. So, that projection system we are calling as the perspective projection system. So, our aerial photographs, because they have been taken from one vantage point, so this is based on the perspective projection system. And due to this perspective projection system, the aerial photographs which we are capturing, they have the relief variation, relief displacement present in the photograph. We will discuss it later. Next technical term here is the camera axis. So, as I told you that in the aerial photogrammetry, when we are taking vertical photograph, our camera axis is vertical. So, it is representing basically the optical axis. So, my camera is here. So, this line is indicating the camera axis line, and it is a line which is passing through the camera lens perpendicular both to the camera plane and the photographic plane. So, there is one photo plane and there is one here is the camera plane. Vertical axis. Vertical axis basically is indicating the direction of the plumb line. The perpendicular, if you are dropping from the camera lens center to the ground plane, it is called the vertical axis or the plumb line. So, camera axis, vertical axis and plumb line, all three will coincide in case of a truly vertical photograph. So, if the photograph is truly vertical, they will all be the same. Then there are terms like ground Nadir point, the point on the ground vertically beneath the perspective center of the camera. So, if I extend my camera axis line, it will cut the ground at a point, and this particular point on the ground will known as the ground Nadir point. And similarly, if I extend it and it will cut the photograph at a point, that is known as the photographic Nadir point. Very simple. Focal length of the camera lens, although it is supplied by the manufacturer when you are procuring the camera, but how do you define it? It is the distance from the optical center of the lens to the focal plane. So, here letter F is written for the focal length of the lens, this is the lens and this is the focal distance. So, this is known as the F when the camera is focused at infinity. Now, so this is a small value we are indicating in millimeters. Air base or camera base also. So, air base is the distance in the air between the two successive exposures. So, one exposure, first exposure, the second exposure was done from the ground. Here the distance between two successive exposure station is known as the air base and camera base. So, this should also be known to us while exposing the photographs up from the air. Next term is the flight line, and this flight line is indicating the flight path. So, this is automatically indicating the meaning. The aircraft, when it is taking the images, it is following a certain path. So, that path is known as the flight line, and in photogrammetry, it is representing the x axis for photographic measurement. So, in this particular diagram, this is the flight line direction. Aircraft is moving from left to right, and this indicates my x directions also for photographic measurements. Y direction will be, y axis will be perpendicular to that, passing through the exposure station. Fiducial marks. So, this is the image photograph now. So, 23 centimeter by 23 centimeter. There are some marks actually while capturing the image, while exposing that. 1, 2, 3 and 4. These are the V-notch marks engraved on the photograph itself, and they are called fiducial marks, and these 4 marks are very helpful to us, because with the help of these fiducial marks we are going to determine the geometrical center of the photograph or principal point of the photograph. So, if I join these opposite fiducial marks together, then I have the two axes. One is my x axis and another in the perpendicular direction is the y axis. So, they are called fiducial axis. Intersection of these two fiducial axes will give me a point at the center of the photograph. and this is called principal point of the photograph. This principal point is very important because very large number of measurements we carry out with respect to principal point. So, our first job whenever we are dealing with the aerial photograph, our first job is to find out the location of the principal point by joining the opposite fiducial marks and the intersection of that. Then photographic center, in case it is vertical photograph, the photographic center, the geometrical center of the photograph and the principal point, they will be exactly same. There are some additional information which is printed on the photograph by the agency who is capturing those photographs and supply you, and that additional information is very important to us because this gives me the time of exposure, when what time the photograph was exposed, what is the focal length, that is also printed on that, what is to which area this photograph belongs. So, there is a certain code for the area. So, area code is printed and the flight has a certain path and row number. So, what is the path and row number in that flight? Suppose in one flight 10 photographs are taken, whether this is photograph number 2 or photograph number 5 or photograph number 6. So, that indicates the flight path and its number in that particular path. So, these information are also very useful to us in photogrammetry. Then once we determine the principal point, the next job is to determine the conjugate principal point. So, in order to determine the conjugate principal point, we are taking help of the principal point which we have already located. So, our first job will be to locate the principal point of the photograph. So, this is my left photo and this is my right photo, successive photo with overlap region. So, I have determined the principal point of left photo and principal point of the right photo as per the procedure explained earlier, and then conjugate principal point will be the principal point of that photograph which is transferred to the next photograph because there is an overlap. So, we can see actually that particular point on the next photograph. Principal point of the next photo we can see on the previous photograph. So, this particular point is seen on this photo and this principal point is seen on the next photo, and if we could transfer these points, then those points are known as conjugate principal point. And now if I join principal point and conjugate principal point together, it indicates the direction of the flight line or the x-axis. Angle of tilt. Now, when we are dealing with the tilted photograph, the camera axis is not truly vertical, but it is inclined. So, when my plumb line is vertical, this is my plumb line direction, the vertical line direction, and here my camera axis is inclined at a certain angle. So, the angle which is made with the plumb line, the camera axis is making a certain angle with the plumb line, and this we call as the angle of tilt. Now, tilted photographs will have actually the shortest ray travelling from the plumb line and the longest ray travelling from the farthest point. So, this will cover a much larger area, but the distortions would be present in this particular photograph as compared to the vertical photograph. So, whenever we are dealing with the tilted photograph and we want to convert them into the vertical photograph, then we have to use a certain procedure in order to apply the corrections. There is another terminology in tilted photograph, and that is the isocenter. So, here in tilted photograph, all our measurements will be carried out with respect to isocenter. In vertical photograph, the measurements are carried out with respect to the principal point. So, we know what is the angle of tilt. Now, this was my angle of tilt, and if I take the bisector of the angle of tilt, so this is the line which is bisecting the angle of tilt. It will cut the photographic plane. This is the tilted photographic plane at a point, and that point is known as the isocenter. So, I will simply take the bisector of the angle of tilt, and it will meet the photographic plane or will locate the isocenter. So, once I locate isocenter in a tilted photograph, I can carry out all the measurements with respect to the tilted photograph. So, that is all about this lecture.